I bought the house on Miller's Ridge for the silence. It sat at the end of a long gravel-dusted lane, a two-story farmhouse of cedar and stone that felt as though it had grown directly out of the earth. During the closing process, I had my attorney double-check the plat maps 3 times. I had spent a decade in the city, living under the thumb of a high-rise co-op board that fined me for the color of my curtains, and I was finished with communal living. The deeds were clear. My property was an unincorporated island of land, bordered by the sprawling, meticulously manicured lawns of the Grandview Estates HOA, but it was not part of them. I owned the dirt, the trees, and the right to be left alone. The first 2 days were bliss. I spent them unpacking boxes and breathing air that didn't smell like exhaust. On the 3rd morning, while I was on my porch drinking coffee, a silver SUV pulled into my gravel drive.
A woman stepped out.
She was dressed in a crisp white blazer and navy slacks, her hair pulled back into a ponytail so tight it seemed to sharpen her features. She walked toward me with a wide, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning. I'm Karen Whitlock, Vice President of the Grandview Estates HOA," she said, extending a hand adorned with a heavy gold ring. "We saw the moving truck. It's so lovely to finally have someone in this house. It's been an eyesore for far too long." "Elias," I said, shaking her hand briefly. "And I plan on keeping it quiet."
"Quiet is what we do best," she chirped.
She began pacing the length of my porch, her eyes darting over my unpacked crates. "So tell me, Elias, what do you do for a living? We like to know the flavor of our neighbors. And what are your plans for the siding? The current cedar is a bit rustic for the Grandview aesthetic." "I work in data security," I replied, leaning against the railing. "And as for the house, I like it exactly as it is. But I should save you some time, Karen. I've checked the records. My property isn't part of your association." The smile faltered for a millisecond before snapping back into place. "Oh, we're aware of the legal technicality. But most residents in the enclave choose to join voluntarily. It's only $500 a month, and it grants you access to the pool, the tennis courts, and, most importantly, our private security and architectural harmony." "I don't play tennis, and I prefer my own harmony," I said. She stepped closer, her tone dropping into something more confidential. "Standard procedure for the neighborhood is for the board to keep a spare key to every residence. You know, for emergencies. Water leaks, fire checks, or if we notice an unauthorized guest while you're traveling. If you give me a copy today, I can get your file started." I felt a cold prickle of alarm. "You want a key to my house?" "It's for your protection, Elias." The answer is no. To the key, and to the HOA. I moved here specifically to avoid this kind of oversight. I'm sure you're great neighbors, but I value my privacy. Karen's face didn't crumble, it hardened. It was like watching a lake freeze over in real time. "I see," she said, her voice now clipped and professional. "Privacy is often a veil for noncompliance. Just remember, Elias, that while you may be independent on paper, you are surrounded by a community that values standards. We'll be watching the progress of your landscaping very closely." She turned on her heel and drove away, leaving a plume of dust that lingered in the air long after she was gone.
2. The Perimeter War.
The harassment began with the flyers. A week after Karen's visit, I found a glossy pamphlet tucked into my mailbox. It wasn't an invitation to a potluck.
It was a call to arms.
"Protect our borders," the headline screamed. Below was a grainy photo of my house, taken from the street. "Non-compliant adjacent properties threaten our property values and security. The board is exploring all options for enforced integration to ensure our community remains a sanctuary." I realized then that my property was more than just a house to Karen. It was a strategic obstacle. My land sat directly between the existing HOA boundary and a 10-acre wooded lot that Karen was lobbying to purchase for a private community park and access road. If she could force my land into the HOA, she could pave a road right through my backyard, connecting the two sections of her empire. I ignored the flyers, but the atmosphere turned toxic. When I went for runs, neighbors who had previously waved now turned their backs. I found violation notices taped to my trees, not for things I had done, but for visual disharmony. I installed a comprehensive security system, 4 cameras with wide-angle lenses and high-fidelity audio. If Karen wanted to play at surveillance, I would ensure I was the one with the recorded evidence.
3. The Man in the Vest.
The escalation reached its zenith on a Friday morning in late September. I was in the kitchen when a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds rattled my front door. It wasn't a knock, it was a demand for entry. I opened the door to find a man standing there who looked like he had been built out of concrete and bad intentions. He was wearing a black tactical vest with a Velcro patch that read HOA Cop, enforcement. He had a radio clipped to his shoulder and a heavy utility belt.
Elias Thorne, he barked.
I'm Officer Miller. I'm here for the mandatory interior safety inspection as authorized by the Grandview Estate's vice president. You're trespassing, I said, my voice remarkably calm. You have no badge, no warrant, and no jurisdiction here. Get off my porch. HOA authority overrides your independent status when a property is deemed a community hazard, Miller said.
He stepped forward, closing the distance.
Now you can step aside, or I can make this difficult. I'm calling the police, I said, reaching for my pocket. Before I could pull my phone, Miller moved with a speed that caught me completely off guard. He threw a heavy looping right hook that caught me square in the jaw.
My vision flared white.
Before I could recover, he tackled me into the entryway, spun me around, and forced me onto my stomach. I felt the bite of heavy-duty plastic zip ties cinching around my wrists. You think you're special because of a piece of paper at the county office?
Miller spat.
He grabbed me by the back of my shirt and dragged me out onto the gravel driveway. You're going to learn about community standards today. He forced me to my knees in the center of the drive. He then reached into a holster I hadn't noticed and pulled out a semi-automatic handgun. He didn't point it at the sky, he pointed it at the back of my head. Karen wants a full inventory of the house, Miller said into his radio. I've got the subject restrained. Proceeding with the sweep.
4. The breaking point.
I knelt there, the gravel digging into my knees, the cold metal of the barrel resting against my skull. My mind was racing through the legalities and the sheer insanity of the moment. This wasn't a neighborly dispute anymore. This was a kidnapping and an armed home invasion disguised as administration. I noticed that in his haste, Miller hadn't tightened the zip tie on my right wrist as much as the left. I began to subtly rotate my hand, feeling the plastic dig into my skin. Miller stepped away to look at my front door, his back to me. He was distracted, adjusting his radio. I strained against the plastic. With a sharp, agonizing pull that I felt to my shoulders, the right tie slipped over the heel of my hand. I was free, but I remained still.
I waited.
Miller turned back to me, the gun lowered slightly toward his hip. Stay down, or I'll put a hole in you for resisting an officer. You aren't an officer, I whispered. He sneered and stepped closer to kick me. As he swung his leg, I lunged. I drove my head into his midsection, knocking the wind out of him. We tumbled into the gravel. I grabbed his gun hand, twisting with every ounce of strength I had. The gun went off once into the dirt, a deafening crack that echoed through the trees. We wrestled for the weapon. Miller was stronger, but I was fighting for my life. I managed to wrench the gun away as we rolled. I scrambled backward, gasping for air, pointing the weapon at him.
Stay down. I screamed. Stay down.
Miller didn't stay down. He reached into his vest for what looked like a second weapon, a knife or perhaps another small pistol. He lunged at me, a snarl of rage on his face. I pulled the trigger. One shot. Miller collapsed instantly, his legs giving out as if the strings had been cut. He slumped into the gravel, unmoving. I immediately dropped the gun. I backed away, my hands raised high, as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. Neighbors were emerging from their homes, staring in stunned silence at the man in the HOA cop vest bleeding out in my driveway. The trial of excess. The legal aftermath was a grueling, 2-year marathon. Miller survived, but the bullet had shattered his spine. He was paralyzed from the waist down, a permanent reminder of Karen Whitlock's enforcement tactics. I was arrested and charged with several counts, including aggravated assault. The case centered on the security footage. The cameras had captured everything: the punch, the zip ties, the gun to my head. It was a clear-cut case of self-defense, until the very end. The prosecution argued that once I had disarmed Miller and stood up, the immediate threat had passed. They played the video in slow motion, showing the 3 seconds between me gaining control of the gun and firing the shot. The judge noted that while Miller was reaching for a second weapon, the use of a firearm against a man who was already losing the physical struggle was proportionally excessive. The verdict was a compromise. I was found guilty of a single count of excessive force following a lawful self-defense. Because of the extreme provocation and the illegality of Miller's presence, the judge spared me prison. I was sentenced to 6 months of house arrest. No felony on my record.
No loss of rights.
Just a half-year of being a prisoner in the very home I had fought to protect.
6.
The fall of the architect. The investigation didn't stop with me. The local district attorney, incensed by the concept of private HOA police, turned his sights on Karen Whitlock. They seized the HOA servers and Karen's personal devices. What they found was a blueprint for tyranny. There were emails to Miller promising him bonuses for every successful extraction of a non-compliant resident. There were records of Karen using HOA funds to hire private investigators to dig up dirt on board members who disagreed with her. Most chilling was a voice memo Karen had recorded for herself. "The Thorn property is the key. If he won't sell, we make the environment so hostile he has no choice. Miller is the hammer. I am the hand." Karen was convicted of conspiracy, criminal coercion, harassment, and facilitating the impersonation of a peace officer. She was sentenced to 7 years in a state penitentiary. Miller, the hammer, was sentenced to 12 years, to be served in a medical wing of the prison. 7. The quiet after the storm. The Grandview Estates HOA didn't survive the scandal. The civil lawsuits from me and other harassed residents drained their reserves, and the insurance company refused to cover criminal acts. Within a year, the association dissolved. The private security signs were taken down, and the fences between properties began to feel like fences again, not battlements. I finished my house arrest yesterday. I stood on my porch, the same spot where Karen first approached me, and watched the sun set over the woods. My house is still cedar and stone. My land is still independent. I don't feel like a victor. I think about Miller often, not with pity, but with a profound weariness. I think about how a woman's desire for a private park and a little bit of power managed to ruin 3 lives and tear a neighborhood apart. Authority is a fragile thing. When it's earned, it protects. When it's fabricated, it destroys everything it touches. I turned back inside, locked my door, with a key only I possess, and finally, for the first time in years, I slept in total silence.